Welcome to Night Bites. Scary story. If you're here, chances are you've been craving that chill down your spine and the kind of stories that haunt you long after they're told. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps push our content to the top of YouTube. Now then, turn off the lights, put on your headphones. Let's begin. Callahan couldn't remember the times when anything was still being filmed at the movie studio in his hometown. According to the nostalgic mustard yellow tint of late Soviet photo prints, he had been a chubby, pigeon-toed blonde toddler back then. Even then, if his parents were to be believed, he was obsessed with cinema. You couldn't pull him away from the TV, a vintage American Zenith with lacquered wooden sides that his father used to slap with a heavy hand when the color image would suddenly shift to garish lilac tones. The TV, like Callahan himself, responded only to a good thump and corrected the colors. As for 3-year-old Callahan, after such reprimands, he would finally peel himself away from the moving screen and, howling in protest, retreat to his room. Callahan remembered the studio from the 1990s. It was a huge, angular building not far from home, horribly dilapidated, painted a depressing hospital green. The doors beneath its slim, columned porticos were crudely boarded up, and the windows of the lower floors bulged with plywood swollen from rain. Higher up, the windows were too massive to board. Enormous grids stretching 2 or even 3 stories tall, weeping broken glass and always maintaining a dull grayness inside, even on the sunniest of days, as though concealing some shadowy twilight life within. The studio faced 2 streets, lined with massive old poplars, leaning over sidewalks where retirees and grim men in leather jackets sat on the curbs, selling everything imaginable. Their wares were laid out on cardboard, overturned boxes, or straight on the pavement. Piles of books, local dried fish, plumbing parts, knit socks and scarves, trinkets, pins, beads, underwear, paintings, jars of pickles. There was something Babylonian, even apocalyptic, in this jumble of goods, like the detritus of a shipwreck, and in the endless rows of makeshift vendors that had taken over the central intersection. Young Callahan passed by out of habit, never looking. He wasn't interested in junk. What he wanted, with an ache in his stomach, was Doctor's sausage and Snickers bars, though he wouldn't have turned down some pickles either. Often there was nothing at all to eat at home, as if under blockade. His parents hadn't seen a paycheck in months. Still, Callahan was always captivated by the studio building. By some miracle, his parents had gotten hold of a used Japanese VCR, miraculously connected to their old-fashioned furniture-style TV. Callahan constantly begged classmates for videocassettes in worn cardboard sleeves. For some reason, the VCR only showed a black and white picture, but it didn't matter. He fell in love with the Hollywood screen world with such sincere and trembling devotion that no girl of his would ever rival it. For life, Terminator, Independence Day, and Titanic remained in his memory in black and white. There was a special charm to it, a tangible border where today's pop culture became timeless classic. Even back then, Callahan would seriously wonder whether a grand-scale film masterpiece could be shot in a post-industrial, poverty-stricken town. And the answer always came back: no. Absolutely impossible. He had no idea that chamber, auteur cinema, even existed. His diet was strictly Hollywood. But every day after school, he would glance reverently at the abandoned studio, and the building, it seemed, would stare back at him with its massive dusty windows, as if acknowledging a kindred soul, preserving a secret known only to the two of them. Callahan desperately dreamed of making movies. By the time he reached middle school, the local government finally took an interest in the former film studio, though sluggishly. For years, The building stood scaffolded, serving as shelter for homeless people and stray dogs. The poplars were cut down after several large branches fell during a storm and crushed part of the informal marketplace, killing a few vendors who were hastily closing up their cardboard stalls. Soon the market was dispersed, and the clunky, rust-colored commercial kiosks, caged in with thick iron bars like they were bracing for a zombie apocalypse, were chipped away from the corners of the building. By the time Callahan had grown into a lanky, focused high schooler, the former studio had finally been restored. Young trees were planted along the sidewalk, and cheerful new windows now revealed a bustling shopping mall inside. The building had become foreign. No longer did anyone from the old film sanctuary watch Callahan with silent approval, affirming his chosen path. His father, upon hearing that Callahan wanted to become a director instead of a lawyer, exploded with rage. His mother wept. Callahan understood his parents. They had endured enough poverty and uncertainty at the factory. No one had it worse, except maybe the painter who lived downstairs, disheveled and single, dragging his smeared canvases to the local art market, and somehow always managing to get drunk on Saturdays, embodying every cliché about the risks of creative professions. Yet Callahan wasn't about to give up on what people like to call, with a sneer, a dream. He graduated high school, and amid his parents' shouting, who nonetheless gave him money for just one attempt, only one, he left for New York, where he successfully enrolled at NYFA. He wasn't top of the class in the entrance exams, but the professors liked his passion. His graduation project was a mockumentary. By that time, the famous Blair Witch Project had long passed its wave, and hundreds, if not thousands, of aspiring directors had crashed and burned trying to replicate its success. But Callahan wasn't trying to follow that path. Raised on Hollywood's sugary fluff and immersed in brutal art house for 5 years at school, he had already found his style. Simple, relatable human stories told with sharp, even shocking strokes. He sincerely wanted to tell his own story, and in just 23 days, working endlessly with a theater student crew and barely putting the camera down, he shot a film about teenagers in a provincial town. Gray courtyards, conflicts with teachers, fights with parents, brawls, cigarettes, vodka, swearing, stairwells that witnessed both urination and kissing, harsh reality clashing with fragile dreams. One of the teens painted pictures, supposedly guided by spirits of the dead, and the plot left it a mystery whether the boy was gifted or just insane. On recommendation from the faculty, Callahan's film was sent to an international film festival, where this student project made quite a splash and even took the top prize. The gates to the big leagues were now open. The ride from the airport, all endless concrete fences and bleak thickets, looked black, white, and gray. Just like the industrial outskirts of his hometown, as if pulled straight from early David Lynch films. Closer to the center, the city was livelier. Many new bright buildings, some neighborhoods now looking just as modern as parts of Manhattan. Callahan was in a cab headed to his parents' place, thinking about the results of his 10-year directing career. Those results were complete crap. All these years, calling his parents on Skype or visiting briefly, he spoke only vaguely about his projects. But the all-seeing internet sold him out. His parents followed his career closely, watching everything that came out with his name in the credits. They smiled proudly at his financial success, but their expressions became strained when it came to the films themselves. Raised on classic American cinema, they could spot trash a mile away. They had the decency not to say it out loud. But now, Callahan was going to his sister's wedding, and there would be guests, and someone was bound to bring up his work. Callahan didn't care when strangers trashed his films. Everyone liked to rip apart domestic cinema. But The thought that some blunt relative might call his projects garbage made his stomach turn. He already knew they were garbage. Callahan asked the taxi driver to stop short, not at his parents' house, but at the parking lot near the shopping mall. The same one that now occupied the former film studio. He had never been inside before, and now he had completely forgotten to buy a gift for his sister. Maybe he'd find something there. But the gift hunt didn't go well. The mall, unable to compete with the newly built, flashier complexes, which had cinemas, bars, and restaurants, was clearly dying. Many boutiques were shuttered, their glass walls covered in dull gray film with the mall's logo. The stores that remained only sold clothes. Bored saleswomen watched Callahan with lifeless eyes. After wandering through the glass corridors, he entered a large, multi-level space with escalators and immediately recognized it as a converted soundstage. He gave up on the gift. He'd think of something later, and climbed upstairs out of curiosity. Up there it was dim, deserted, quiet. Only the ventilation hummed. The modified yet still recognizable studio spaces filled him with melancholy and strangely matched his mood. Callahan knew that, once upon a time, decent films had been shot here. Children's fairy tales, modest American melodramas, even war films. The last war-themed project he had worked on was a bloated TV miniseries filled with pompous dialogue and Nazi officers in tight black uniforms, overplucked eyebrows, and bright lipstick. They only lacked latex whips. Any historian watching would have a seizure, but it aired in prime time, and people watched it enough for the network to order a sequel. The only good part? Budget kickbacks. The producers were thrilled. Callahan got a good cut, too. He looked at himself in the reflection of the gray-tinted glass and flipped off his own image, and then noticed someone moving behind the glass, behind that dim veil. There were tightly packed massage tables and people lying on them. Was it some kind of massage clinic? There was no sign yet. Suddenly, someone behind the divider started coughing, a deep, phlegmy, gurgling cough, like they had late-stage tuberculosis or severe chronic bronchitis. Callahan recoiled in disgust and quickly walked away. The last thing he needed was to bump into some sick janitor. Callahan briefly wondered whether he could try to revive the film studio. Gather a team of like-minded people, buy the building. His mind, now fully trained to think in financial terms, immediately labeled the idea as hopeless. Who would want that? Certainly not him. There wouldn't be kickbacks. There'd just be bankruptcy. And yet, what a beginning it had been. After the explosive debut, Callahan made a couple more art house mockumentaries about teens, somewhat derivative, but still honest and well-reviewed. Then he was invited to direct commercial films, and things began to spiral. It wasn't the tiny budgets or the absence of big-name actors that scared him. What terrified him was the producer's concept of commercial viability. His first modestly budgeted film was mutilated in the script phase. So much so that Callahan wanted to walk away. But he needed to press forward, to prove himself, to get easier approvals for future budgets. Gritting his teeth, he finished the project, though what was meant to be a drama ended up a clumsy, saccharine melodrama. To top it off, the theatrical release brought in so little money that any director in his place would feel not just used, but publicly humiliated. Feature films proved so painful that after several agonizing months, Callahan switched to serials. They were being churned out non-stop. A series can be a masterpiece, after all, but the reality of TV show production turned out far uglier than his mentors had warned. There was more money, so the producers were nastier and more controlling. The crews were full of venom and gossip, and it quickly became clear that no one cared about quality. A primetime TV drama exists to fill time between commercials. It didn't matter what filled that space, only that it was easy to swallow. Callahan tried to fight back. He quit projects mid-production in protest, but after realizing how quickly he was becoming persona non grata, he came crawling back to the same producers he'd previously clashed with. Some grudgingly took him back, and Callahan eventually simply adapted. He just kept working, no matter what. The process of adapting felt like a slow death of some deeply buried nerve. In the TV world, success was purely commercial, and Callahan, steeped in the values of his environment, developed a taste for money. At first it was a consolation, then a justification. For the plastic window frames in period dramas, the wooden actors, the bloated, watery scripts, and all the rest. 5, maybe 7 years in, he realized with horror that he was losing his ability to distinguish good cinema from bad. His aesthetic receptors were dying. Now he could only spot trash intellectually, but he could smell profitability a mile away. A month ago, Callahan had randomly run into a former classmate from film school. The guy had never really found his place, still bouncing between rented apartments and filming low-budget art house shorts in his spare time, uploading them to YouTube where they barely got any views. He looked bloated and haggard, easily 15 years older than he was, though they were the same age. Callahan, in contrast, sported a trendy asymmetrical haircut that flattered his sharp features and walked arm in arm with his new girlfriend, an Instagram star with bright turquoise dreadlocks whose paradoxical mix of wit and delightful airheadedness was oddly charming. He saw himself from the outside, polished and successful, and didn't even try to hide his sense of superiority. Yet he sincerely offered to help, proposing his classmate a job. The guy refused immediately. Then he said something that lodged in Callahan like a splinter. "I really thought you'd be the American James Cameron, that you'd build something that would blow everyone away. But you're not Cameron. You're just Callahan." Those words echoed in Callahan's head now as he descended the mall's escalator. The cursed building reminded him too much of his own work. It still brought in money, decently so. But in every other sense, it was empty, pointless, and worthless. In the lobby, on a small platform, stood something like a souvenir or a photo op prop. An old, 50-year-old film camera with reel holders mounted on a wooden tripod, apparently left by the mall owner as a tribute to the building's cinematic past. Or maybe it had been put there by the owners of the half-dead bar in the lobby. The bar was called No More Movies. Ironic. As Callahan approached the doors, he clearly heard someone descending the stairs into the empty lobby, on crutches, and coughing. But he didn't turn around and quickly stepped outside. Weddings bored him. After years of life in New York, Callahan had gotten used to events on a very different scale. The apartment building covered in pink hearts, the mismatched car convoy, the screeching MC, the rapidly intoxicated distant relatives. It all filled him with a mix of discomfort and a strong urge to slip away unnoticed. The restaurant, though, was nice, shaded with Romanesque arches that gave it an air of mystery. Out of professional habit, Callahan mentally scouted the place for potential film scenes. He idly scanned the guests, many of whom he didn't recognize. Friends of his sister, maybe, or in-laws. He fought off the growing urge to leave, not wanting to face another wave of fake enthusiasm. Everyone here already knew he was a famous director. Many had at least glanced at his work, and Callahan had already heard about 200 over-the-top compliments, which seemed wildly insincere to him, about 100 150 inquiries about what he was currently working on and when he'd get married, and around 100 pitches for life stories that urgently needed to be turned into Oscar-worthy masterpieces. Callahan eventually got up, intending to take a short walk in the park outside the restaurant and then, for appearance's sake, come back. But just as he stood, someone grabbed his elbow. It was a complete stranger, a guy with a full hipster beard and oversized horn-rimmed glasses, large enough to look like window panes. "I've seen some of your stuff," the guy said, exhaling a cloud of fruity vapor from his e-cig. "Wonderful," Callahan muttered and tried to pull away. "Honestly, your series? Total crap," the guy said calmly. "Well, thanks for the kind words." Callahan shook off the hand and stood up. "I wanted to show you something." The guy pulled out an iPhone. "Your own film?" Callahan asked, annoyed. "Relax," the guy smiled knowingly. "Do you watch web series?" "I don't have time for that," Callahan grumbled, stepping aside. Seemed like the guy wanted to pitch himself as an indie filmmaker. Callahan made a point of never promoting others' projects, especially low-budget amateur stuff. Everyone and their cousin was shooting indie films now. "Wait up," the guy said, following him. "You heard of a web series called Samovar?" "Nope," Callahan snapped. "Well, you will. It's a mockumentary. Big buzz lately. Shot by one of ours. Local guy. I thought you two could collaborate. His style is super close to your early feature stuff. Together you'd make a masterpiece." Callahan had zero interest in watching some local guy's work and was about to tell him to buzz off. But then the guy opened YouTube on his phone, and from the very first seconds, Callahan froze in place, captivated by the editing rhythm and visual tone. A floating camera, muffled audio, grim gray hues, the peeling hallway of some dump, exactly how he used to film. The dump turned out to be a crumbling hospital. Crowded beds, people on them, disabled people, limbless. Where had this been filmed? If it was no budget, how? It all looked terrifyingly real. "Hooked, huh?" The bearded guy grinned. "Everyone gets hooked." Callahan, in a trance, took the iPhone and stared at the screen. The YouTube channel belonged to someone named Glinsky. Creator, director, cinematographer, editor. Callahan had never heard of him. "Why Samovar?" Callahan asked, already slipping into the world behind the tiny screen. "Used to be what they called war invalids, the ones with no arms or legs." "Based on a novel?" Callahan vaguely remembered a book from film school with the same title and a similar theme. "No, the dude writes his own scripts." "Holy shit," Callahan said sincerely. Just then, the hipster got a call from someone named Katya. He apologized, took the phone back, and stepped aside. Callahan caught bits of the conversation, apologies and assurances that the guy really was at a wedding, not out somewhere shady. Callahan immediately forgot about the guy. He opened YouTube on his own phone, found Glinsky's channel, and mentally teleported into the bleak hospital filled with war-disabled patients. Holding his device, he retreated to a dim corner of the hall and sat there until the celebration ended. He re-watched the 3 episodes of Samovar, all that was uploaded, over and over. He read the comments. Viewers were horrified, amazed, furious, praising the creator for tackling such a taboo subject and accusing him of slandering the past. The channel was buzzing with activity. Glinsky responded rarely, but with precise, polite remarks. People kept asking where he'd found such actors and how he created such shockingly realistic effects on a micro-budget. The black and white series played out like a retro documentary, depicting the brutal routine of a provincial hospital where war invalids were mysteriously sent to die. In episode 3, there was a harrowing scene where a doctor euthanized a limbless patient at his own request. The sheer documentary-level realism is what made the project so gripping. In every minute of this YouTube film, created by some unknown figure with no visible film education, there was more raw, horrifying truth than in all of Callahan's projects put together. It was masterful, high-level mockumentary cinema. And Callahan couldn't understand how a bunch of amateurs had pulled it off. By morning, with his head pounding and eyes aching, Callahan finally closed YouTube on his laptop and messaged Glinsky directly. He didn't even know what Glinsky looked like. The guy's profile picture was a grinning black cat. He had no idea if Glinsky was a real surname or a pseudonym, not even how old the guy was. But for the first time in his life, Callahan wanted to offer another director a collaboration. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit. Glinsky, according to his last seen status, was a night owl. He probably wouldn't reply before noon. A few hours passed. Callahan realized, to his own surprise, that he was nervous. He was actually scared the guy might reject him, the way his old film school buddy had. But Glinsky replied, and agreed to meet. George Glinsky turned out to be a wiry young man, eerily resembling the black cat on his avatar, just thinner. Dark-haired, flat-headed, with a triangular face and large greenish eyes. There was something feline in his demeanor, unhurried, smooth and subtly unsettling. He spoke softly, with polished politeness. "Very glad to meet you. Your remarkable work inspired me." "You mean my early films, of course?" Callahan blurted out. "Strangely enough, no," Glinsky said calmly. "Your early work is decent, even quite good in places. But I was more inspired by your recent projects. You know, the ones the whole country watches." "Well, I wouldn't say the whole country," Callahan muttered awkwardly. "What did you see in them?" "Can I be honest with you?" "Of course. I hope you won't take offense. No need to apologize. Just say it. The thing is, your films are so stunningly hollow, so brilliantly fake, so full of lies and artifice. They're masterpieces, in their own way. Absolute bottom. You can't sink lower. A perfect nothing in a vacuum. While watching your latest series, I felt an overwhelming urge to create something radically different, packed with meaning and raw truth." Wow. Callahan swallowed the insult. After all, this alley cat-looking self-made filmmaker was just stating the truth. "Sorry again," Glinsky said softly. "Whatever. Actually, I wanted to offer you a collaboration. That thing you're making, it could break out way beyond YouTube. It could win an award." Glinsky shrugged. "Honestly, I just wanted to show people this story. The hospital. It's real. Did you know that before the film studio, this building was a military hospital? One of those places where disabled soldiers were sent after World War II. Authorities wanted to clean up the big cities, get rid of beggars. War against vagrancy and parasitism, they called it. Samovars. That's what they called the ones with no limbs. Tanks. The legless ones who rolled around on boards with wheels. No one likes to talk about it. How many maimed veterans were just discarded after the war?" "I've read about it," Callahan said. "But the story got blown up in the 90s. Could have been made up. Urban legend." "No," Glinsky said sharply. "It's all true. In the mid-1950s, there was a fire. It's still unclear whether it was an accident or arson. Few staff, overcrowded wards. Almost no one made it out. Imagine how many died. Then in the late 50s, they built the studio on the ruins. That's the story." "Well," Callahan sighed. He didn't feel like arguing. "I have to say, I admire your bravery, or your recklessness. Choosing such a controversial and difficult topic for your first film, Commenters are already tearing into you on YouTube. Get ready. There's a lot more crap coming your way. Guaranteed. That doesn't matter, Glinsky said. I'm showing the truth. If possible, I'd like to see your shooting process. Glinsky paused for a long time. He seemed to hesitate, not wanting to reveal his methods. But what secrets could a low-budget web filmmaker possibly have? All right, he said at last. Fine. It might be useful for you, but on two conditions. First, you do exactly what I say. Second, don't talk to the actors. At all. Okay, Callahan shrugged. Weird, but whatever. Who knows what kind of setup an indie director has? Maybe he'd managed to find actual disabled actors somewhere. I really am curious, he added. But why do you think this will be useful for me? Forgive me once more, but... Glinsky smiled, a shy smile that contrasted sharply with the cruelty of his words. I hate hacks, in every field, but especially in art. I hope that after what you'll see on set, you'll lose all desire to produce crap. Callahan bristled. So he was working with real disabled people then. He felt a hot surge of irritation, like acid in his throat, but he swallowed it. He couldn't forgive himself if he missed the chance to see how someone created cinema that pulled viewers' souls through a meat grinder. He wasn't even sure he ever wanted to make something like that himself. He'd had his fill of gritty mockumentary back in film school, but he wanted to bring this director into the big leagues, even if he regretted it 100 times later. Come to the studio at 7 this evening, Glinsky said. Enter through the back courtyard, entrance number 1. Callahan, for some reason, felt a childlike thrill. He wasn't even surprised. That building, the one that had mesmerized him in his school years, still held room for real cinema. The place was enormous. Besides the mall, it housed all kinds of offices. Apparently, space had been found for a small soundstage, too. You're renting space there? Sort of. Glinsky smiled faintly again. His large, greenish eyes watched Callahan with a strange, cold curiosity. At 7 p.m., Callahan stood in the studio courtyard. The snow here had mostly melted. The last rays of sunset were climbing higher up the tall building across the way, as if marking the arrival of twilight in the narrow courtyard like a liquid filling a faceted glass. The parking lot was nearly empty, despite the early hour. There were no people in sight. Somewhere above, an old window banged open and shut with irritating frequency. Someone kept opening and closing it, rhythmically, like a metronome. Callahan was already late for his flight because of this meeting, but he didn't regret it. No one in New York was really waiting for him. He had broken up with the Instagram model with the turquoise dreads, and just the thought of starting a new project made him sick. For the first time in years, something was happening in his life that sparked genuine interest. Something real, not the fake creativity and fake relationships he'd gotten so used to. Pseudo-art and pseudo-intimacy. That's all he'd known for a decade. To kill time before the meeting, Callahan had been reading online articles about the studio's history. Turns out, it really had once been a military hospital. There was a whole collection of urban legends tied to the place, including stories that even now, ghosts of war invalids could be seen wandering the mall's boutiques and corridors, the same ones who had burned alive over 50 years ago. Former studio workers also claimed to have seen poltergeists, especially when filming war scenes. Callahan vaguely remembered hearing similar tales in childhood, but he had ignored them then. His classmates were too scared to sneak into the abandoned studio. They said a kid had once disappeared inside, found days later covered in soot, hair turned white, completely insane. Callahan had never been into exploring creepy ruins. He preferred to spend his time watching movies. Glinsky appeared beside him like a ghost, so suddenly that Callahan flinched. The courtyard was already deep in shadow. The window above still banged open and shut. A draft? After everything he'd read about poltergeists, the place gave him the creeps. He even recalled the coughing and the sound of crutches from the mall the other day. Callahan forced a smirk. Amazing what fear your own mind can conjure from nothing. "Good evening. Let's go," said Glinsky. "Why is it so empty here?" Callahan asked. "Rent's too high. Not many tenants left." "But how do you—" "I work here as a security guard. I don't pay for space." Intrigued, Callahan followed. How did this self-made director manage to sneak in a whole film crew, apparently without permission? From what he'd seen, the cast was extensive. Along a narrow hallway stood an office desk. On it, a modest but decent video camera stared at Callahan with its rectangular lens hood. Glinsky picked it up like a weapon. He checked the time. Almost 7:30. That's exactly when it all started. What started? The fire in the hospital. It lasted until 1 a.m. If we're lucky, you'll have enough time to see everything. "I don't understand what you're talking about," Callahan said, getting irritated. The guy sounded like a nut. Callahan had already sensed it. The dude was talented but seriously off. Glinsky turned to him and stared hard. In the dim hallway, his eyes seemed to glint faintly, like a cat's. "Remember the rules? Don't speak to anyone you see here. Do exactly what I say." "Oh, come on. I don't get any of this." "I don't fully get it either, though I've read everything I could on the topic. One theory says living beings leave behind energy imprints. Places with mass deaths have the strongest ones. Apparently, these imprints retain some form of consciousness. There's also a theory that matter doesn't really exist, that everything in the universe is just energy." Callahan turned to leave. A tour with a lunatic was the last thing he needed. Suddenly, a nearby door creaked open and slammed shut on its own. Slowly, then forcefully. Callahan hadn't processed what he saw yet, but a chill like icy beads ran down his spine. "It's starting," Glinsky said with satisfaction. "Looks like you've piqued their interest. They barely react to me anymore. Got too used to me, but I still need footage." "Who are they?" Callahan whispered, though deep down he already knew. "My pseudo-actors," Glinsky replied with cold irony. Another door slammed elsewhere, then another. Voices echoed from the empty offices. "You'll see them easily here," Glinsky added. "They want to be seen, because they were murdered, burned alive. They want the world to know. Come." Callahan didn't listen. He turned to run, only to recoil in shock. Coming straight toward him, without noticing him, was an imposing man with a gray goatee, wearing an old-fashioned white medical cap and a Soviet-era lab coat. The doctor looked solid, not transparent or ghostly, but he turned into one of the dark office rooms and simply vanished. Callahan opened his mouth in silence and stepped back. He wasn't crazy. He had seen what he had seen. "So you're filming ghosts," Callahan said. He just needed to say it out loud to fully believe it. "Why? How? How did it start?" Glinsky shrugged slightly, shifting the camera in his hands. "I once dreamed of making movies, like you. Life didn't allow it. By the way, Glinsky isn't even my real name, just some dumb placeholder. I got a job here as a night guard. At first I was terrified, thought I'd lost my mind, almost quit. Then I realized they don't show themselves to just anyone. They want something from me. I figured out what, and started filming. But I've grown stale for them. They barely react to me anymore. But you..." All the while, Callahan had been walking forward down the corridor on autopilot. At some point, the space around him began to shift subtly. It was impossible to say exactly when the narrow drywall hallway had turned into a broad corridor painted with institutional oil-based paint. The cheap office doors had become wide, sturdy ones, big enough to move heavy hospital gurneys through. "I've gotten somewhat used to all of this," Glinsky whispered beside him. "But you never fully adapt." They moved slowly onward. Everything was dim and gray, lit by unnatural, diffuse light sources that seemed not quite right. The walls wavered slightly, as if in a light mist, bending, warping, then returning to form. Callahan instinctively stuck close to Glinsky, nearly shoulder to shoulder. He was truly afraid. Part of him also feared he'd gone insane. He began glancing into the rooms. The doors were all wide open. Beds crammed together so tightly you could only squeeze through sideways. And on every bed lay a person. Invalids. Maimed bodies. A cruel word surfaced in his mind. Stumps. Every patient was missing at least 2 limbs. The lucky ones had 1 arm and 1 leg. They moved around on crutches, clumsy but trained to balance. Most had neither arms nor legs. The worst were those missing all limbs. They lay in their beds, covered with tiny, childlike blankets, their oversized adult heads resting on pillows. Gaunt, unshaven, leathery, aged faces with hauntingly clear eyes that shone like cracked crystal. Callahan couldn't feel his legs. He remembered his own recent war series, and if shame could kill, he would have dropped dead right there. Like a child, he clutched Glinsky's arm, afraid to get lost in this impossible pseudo-reality. Why do you think they were murdered?" he whispered. "They were soldiers. Heroes. Why would anyone kill them?" "Who knows anymore?" Glinsky said flatly. His silky politeness was gone. "Even I don't know. They've never shown me the fire. Sometimes I think they only reveal what my mind can handle." Doctors, nurses, and the walking invalids moved past them as if they were the ghosts. Callahan and Glinsky had to step aside to avoid bumping into them. It was terrifying to think they might be touched. "They can't see us?" "I'm not sure. Maybe they sense us. But do not speak to them. We are walking a thin line between their world and ours. Don't engage no matter what." "What happens if I do?" "Nothing good." "How do you know?" "I just do," Glinsky said with a tone that made Callahan shut up. The corridor opened into a large room, like a workshop, with benches and tables. This was where the more able-bodied patients were taught simple tasks. Callahan saw legless veterans sewing boots. A man with no arms typed with his toes on a typewriter. Another man, missing both hands, with bones visibly protruding from his forearms, struggled to grip a pencil between the stumps. Callahan felt nauseous. Nearby, on a bench, sat an old soldier missing an arm and a leg. He was trying to pick up a dropped crutch. He looked like someone Callahan's father might have known. Same deep-set eyes and sharp cheek folds. The man edged forward, leaning dangerously to one side, almost tipping over. Then he looked straight at Callahan. "Son," he said. "Son, help me." Reflexively, Callahan bent to retrieve the crutch. "Hey!" Glinsky snapped, turning around. He'd been filming the handless boy. "Thank you, son," said the old man. "You're welcome," Callahan replied automatically. And then, as if someone had turned off the lights, everything went dark. So suddenly that Callahan thought he'd blacked out. Gradually, the darkness lifted, dim gray light leaking through dirty windows. The room came into focus, completely blackened by fire. The walls were scorched, the air thick with the stink of old ash. The benches and tables were charred stumps, and the piles of ash near the windows were corpses, burned down to the bone. "Oh, hell no," Callahan muttered, spinning around, not wanting to believe what he was seeing. "George, Somebody! The air was bitter and sour with wet soot. Everything was terrifyingly real. Ash crunched underfoot. If this was some ghostly illusion, it was too damn tangible. Panic set in. Callahan stumbled across the burnt hall. The yawning, dark corridors terrified him. His eyes fixed on the windows, softly glowing as if covered in frosted glass. Why weren't they broken? What was beyond them? Maybe, if he broke through, the nightmare would end. Callahan grabbed a charred plank, solid and grimy in his hands, and slammed it into the nearest window. But instead of glass, it hit some sort of film, strong, taut, almost alive. No matter how hard he hit or pulled, it wouldn't tear. It was like a dream. One of those where you try to wake up, try to move, but your mind thrashes helplessly in the grip of sleep. Eventually you wake, drenched in sweat, shaken to your core. Maybe I'm dead, he thought. Maybe I'm a ghost too. Maybe Glinsky knocked me out the moment I walked in, and this is just some concussion-fueled nightmare. Maybe I've gone insane. Callahan didn't know how much time had passed. His phone had no signal and showed 10:30 a.m. for some reason. Thankfully, the battery was nearly full. He sat on the floor, surrounded by debris and ashes, rocking back and forth like a madman. He recalled those childhood stories about the boy who vanished in the old studio, reappearing days later, scorched, gray-haired, and completely unhinged. Why had the ghosts taken him? What did they want? They want to be seen, Glinsky's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes I think they show only what your psyche can handle. What do you want to show me? Callahan whispered, tasting ash on his lips. What? What am I supposed to do? He shouted. The dead, ghostly building replied with silence. Then Callahan stood. He headed down one of the corridors. There had to be a way out. It wasn't as dark as it had seemed at first. Faint, cold light leaked through open doors. Inside, burned-out wards, blackened metal bed frames, bodies reduced to piles of ash. What terrified him more than the corpses were the stains on the walls. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. His peripheral vision caught something moving. He kept flinching and turning. Then it clicked. The soot patterns and cracks in the peeling paint formed faces. Agonized, contorted faces, eyes bulging, mouths agape in silent screams. Callahan was hypnotized by horror. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone. He had to capture it, to prove he wasn't imagining it, to have proof if he made it out alive. And the faces began to fade, as if sinking back into the walls. On the phone screen, it looked like an opening credit sequence. Then he understood. They wanted him to film it. He didn't turn the camera off again. He just kept walking, holding the phone in front of him, praying the battery would last. For some reason, they'd chosen him. Maybe because he could endure it without losing his mind. He filmed the burned-out wards, the limbless bodies on the beds, filmed the windows beneath which lay the scorched corpses of those who had tried to escape. Then, the cold light began to change hue, glowing blood red. As he walked forward, Callahan saw and filmed the wards engulfed in flames, where behind walls of fire people writhed and screamed. Then he saw and filmed how the fire spread, creeping across wooden beams. First smoke, then timid flames, then a blazing inferno devouring everything in its path. It was like someone was showing him a reverse montage, backward through time. Callahan was stunned, dazed. His arm was numb from holding the phone, but he kept filming. Perhaps he really was one of the few who wouldn't flinch, who wouldn't run, who would just keep filming. The next ward was untouched. White beds, quiet, helpless patients. And on the far wall, a clean window, through which he saw an overgrown birch courtyard, and a teenager outside. The boy raised a Molotov cocktail to throw through the window. Callahan saw the boy's face. Clearly, even on the phone screen, the face of the arsonist. It looked familiar. And then a thought, like someone whispering in his ear. It resembled a local politician. The same one immortalized in a statue 2 blocks from here. The next ward, same courtyard beyond the window. Disabled patients in wheelchairs, wrapped in blankets, left outside to breathe the spring air. The same teenage boy and his friends, climbing the fence out of boredom, to gawk at the samovars hauled in from across the country. Words were exchanged, insults. What are you staring at? Go to hell. Too bad you can't walk. Then roll away. Punk. Freeloader. Worthless. Everything the boy had heard from his father his entire life. But he couldn't throw a Molotov at his powerful father. So he threw it at the helpless ones. The arson case had likely been buried. No one ever found out. And maybe no one ever would have. Maybe Callahan was being allowed to leave. Like Glinsky had once been. Like the boy. Though he'd gone mad instead of telling anyone. But Callahan kept walking, mesmerized by the footage on his screen. Finally, real images. Finally, something that mattered, that carried true meaning. The final room was a large, open ward. Wide windows, a double door at the far end. Probably once used to wheel patients out on gurneys. Callahan entered, phone still filming, and saw rows of beds. Most were empty, but near the back wall, under one of the windows, lay a blackened, twisted body, its features impossible to make out. Suddenly, the body moved. It turned its head, lifted what remained of an arm, or stump, and looked straight at Callahan. "You're not one of them," the burnt figure whispered. "You can tell the truth." Callahan nodded, throat tight. He lowered the phone. Something inside him broke. He wept. Not out of fear, but because he had finally seen something real. Then the phone went dark. Battery dead. He stood in the ward, unable to move. The light began to fade. The walls turned black again. The air filled with the smell of old smoke and rot. The sounds of groaning and coughing echoed from behind. The building began to dissolve around him, or maybe he just stopped seeing it. At some point, someone took his hand. It was Glinsky, smiling faintly. "Welcome back." They were in the same corridor, the modern one, with white walls and glass doors. The cheap office lights flickered above. Everything was back. Callahan collapsed. He woke up in his hotel room, fully dressed, phone beside him, plugged into a charger. The video files were intact. He watched them. Again, and again, and again. He didn't fly back to New York. Didn't call anyone, just sat and edited, without sleep, without food, without thought. And 2 weeks later, he uploaded the finished film to YouTube. It was called Studio One. That's all for tonight. If this story got under your skin, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Chilling tales, dark secrets, and nightmares lurking in the shadows. We'll meet again in the next episode of Night Bites. Scary story. Sleep tight, if you still can.